Hello, this is Mike. In this screencast, I'd like to look at one of the most common and popular tools available to us in terms of a social media implementation, the concept of the social network. I want to present just some of the brief background to social networking, highlight the potential business applications, and just draw a subtle distinction between business to consumer and business to business uses. So to begin with, let's look at social networks. The origins of social networks, of course, go back centuries, and the idea of merchants meeting together in the coffee houses of 16th and 17th century London to do business and trade. But in terms of the online world, I guess in the early days of the web, the earliest precursor was the rather static and asynchronous discussion board format. Reingold, way back in the early 90s, coined the term virtual community for the first time. And he was particularly interested in the way that individuals, whether for personal or business uses, would cluster together around shared interests through these boards. As Web 2 technologies have advanced, so the discussion board format has advanced too, and they've become far more dynamic. And really, social networks leverage this new way to interact and to share and distribute content through the technology. Communities can be organized around lots of different things. They may be based on a theme or a subject. They might be more personal or overtly commercial, but the emphasis is all the same. A social network is a platform, a tool through which members of that network can build relationships, whatever the basis those relationships are based on. Family and friends, commercial, charitable, political, whatever it may be. In terms of the platforms we know now, probably the earliest, or certainly the earliest mainstream social network was 6 Degrees, founded by Andrew Weinreich. It was a friendship network, and it was based on the idea of 6 degrees of freedom separating any two people on the planet. In other words, between you and I, there will be no more than 5 intermediaries, and we'll know each other. It was moderately popular, but really it collapsed around 2000 because of the business model wasn't sound, and advertising revenue in particular was nowhere near as strong as had been expected. Others were already being set up in its wake, however. Rise.com was founded by a group of entrepreneurs in San Francisco. The main one was Adrian Scott, who later went on to found Friendster and, of course, the much more successful LinkedIn. Rise was popular. It used the technology really well. Unfortunately, for its time, it was probably a little over-ambitious. It started to get advertising revenue, but it dropped off because the technology wasn't stable enough and there were more network downtime as the network grew. So it was the technology let Rise down rather than anything else. 2003, 6 years after 6 Degrees, MySpace was founded. Essentially, it was set up by a group of eUniverse employees who were avid Friendster users, and they kind of missed the gap it had left, and so they set up their own version using similar but more stable technologies. What happened with MySpace, however, is that teenage use of the internet was growing rapidly at that point in the US, and so MySpace quickly gained the teen market. And by 2007, well, it was valued at $12 billion US. A year after MySpace, perhaps spotting a gap, Zuckerberg, of course, famously launched what was originally called the Facebook.com. It was set up at Harvard University. You needed a Harvard email to join it, but gradually it was rolled out in a much more structured way to other universities, to high schools, and so on, being rebranded as Facebook we know today in 2005, Zuckerberg having to spend about $200,000 US on the domain name. So it was rolled out gradually. The technology could therefore keep pace with the growth in membership. And by 2008, it had overtaken MySpace completely in terms of both membership and financial value. It wasn't the end of MySpace, although it could very easily have been and almost was. The company very shrewdly decided, okay, we need to go back to a more thematic base. And so, whereas Facebook was all about friendships and building personal and then later business relationships, MySpace went back to basics and very successfully reoriented itself around the music industry and musical themes. And so it survived to this day in a quite different format. They're just some of the key milestones in the growth of social networks. In terms of business use, really from the very outset, they've been put to commercial usage. The advantage for us is that social networks, although there's downside to this very obviously, they do blur the distinction between public and private selves. We pretty much live in social networks from getting up on a morning to going to bed at night, and maybe after we've gone to bed. Like, who's not checked their Facebook page before bed, for instance? So this blur means that we're constantly online and we're therefore constantly marketing targets. And this blurred distinction also means that we can be marketed at in much more subtle and creative ways. The social networks themselves are great as part of a multi-channel strategy too. They can help build brand awareness, for example, through sales techniques, so an example of an external relationship, but they foster internal relationships too, recruitment and development of employees, for example. So social networks have multiple business usage. They're all based on the conversational model, however, and typically we join networks through word of mouth. Might be a direct email invitation, perhaps. My first experience of Google Plus was an email invite from a colleague. It might be I tend to go with the herd, and so once I saw a lot of people were on Facebook that I knew, I decided to dip my toe in the water and try it. So it's conversational and it's based on word of mouth. The thing about social networks is that they provide ways to directly engage. We can have conversations, whether it's personal, private, commercial, or non-commercial. And of course, for those concerned about security, about confidentiality, about control, we've seen the so-called white label networks appear. In other words, intranet copies of the main social networking platforms just used within an organization who maybe doesn't want to communicate in the outside world. There are also very closed external networks. You may know some of in your own industry. There are certainly a number of social networks that are just for academics and students, but most industries will have something. So there's a lot of different types of social network with different external and internal advantages to organizations. And the shrewd business can use them for a whole variety of applications. Social networks are great for mining prospects, so they can be used for lead generation, sales. After the sales, then they can provide customer care and support. Through special offers, through conversation and interaction, you can foster loyalty. You can seek key stakeholder involvement in the development of new products and services, get feedback on pilots prior to a launch perhaps, and you can use the network as a key promotional channel in its own right. So from business terms, social networks are great for brand management, but also they have broader uses. A lot of organizations turn straight to social networks as a way of distributing news and press releases, for example. They can be used to foster corporate social responsibility or to engage in cause-related marketing activities. And generally speaking, they keep stakeholders engaged. And nowhere is this more evident than in times of distress. If we have a crisis with a product, a service, perhaps a natural disaster, tools such as Facebook, Twitter, they're amazingly effective as a means of containing and managing a crisis and keeping everyone, all the key stakeholders, fully informed. So lots and lots of uses there. In terms of approaches to business, I would say that social networks are of value to both business to consumer and business to business sectors. Although I do feel that B2B is often neglected in the literature, possibly because it's easier to study, possibly because of the spread of platforms, particularly Facebook, with a more personal orientation. The emphasis on B2C tends to dominate a lot of our discussions, but please remember, in business-to-business context too, social networks can be great. Inside the organization, they're a fantastic communication tool, but also externally with not just customers, but other members of the supply chain, for instance, they can be a very good way of spreading professional networks too. It's not confined to straightforward B2C and B2B. In the third sector and the charitable sector, many organizations engage in both B2C and B2B activities, as indeed, in the commercial world they do too. Provided we use social networks in a strategic manner, however, I personally believe social networks are suitable for everyone, provided we follow a few basic principles. In terms of market leaders, well, they change all the time. I think it's helpful to use Facebook and LinkedIn as examples. Facebook is a personal network. It's designed for friendship and friends and family relationships, but organizations that are smart can develop a corporate presence there. And so a lot of business to consumer marketing takes place through Facebook. Less B2B, more a B2C emphasis, but you will find both there. LinkedIn is kind of the opposite. It was designed really to foster professional relationships among individuals. It really is the self-promotion in the literal sense platform. But company profiles have been developed that are very Facebook-like in terms of its pages, and we see communities of practice building up in there. The emphasis, typically, if you look at the content of LinkedIn, is on business-to-business marketing, the provision, for example, of consultancy services to businesses is perhaps one of the largest sectors represented on LinkedIn. So there's a strong B2B emphasis too, although people use it for business-to-consumer marketing also. So Facebook exemplifies B2C with some B2B evident. LinkedIn is the opposite. B2B dominant, some B2C there too. But both illustrate perfectly the advantages of social networking. So that's just a brief background to social networking. It's been around pretty much as long as the web has been around, and of course offline much, much longer. There are a variety of business applications, all equally conducive to business to consumer and business to business modes of business, provided you remember it's a conversational business model. The clue, whether you're talking B2C or B2B, is the word social in social network. Thank you.